right, we're in chapter 19. This is Empires in Collision, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. Although really there's not a whole lot about Europe in this section. It's really, Europe is on the periphery. And this is looking at how European influence, specifically the influence of industrialization, affected countries in East Asia and the Middle East. So really a more global focus here, bringing us up all the way almost into World War I, which we'll be talking more about in next week's chapter. Keep in mind, we're on chapter 19, so we only have 4 more chapters, believe it or not, left to go. So nearing the end here. So here is our introduction. Several years ago, China was strong. In over 100 years after the 1840 Opium War, China suffered immensely from aggression, wars, and chaos. Speaking in early 2017, Chinese President Xi Jinping thus reminded his listeners of Britain's 19th century violent intrusion into China's history, bearing shiploads of highly addictive opium. This conflict marked the beginning of what the Chinese still describe as a century of humiliation. In official Chinese thinking, it was only the victory of the Chinese Communist Party that enabled China to finally escape that shameful past. Memories of the Opium War remain a central element of China's patriotic education for the young, serving as a warning against uncritical admiration of the West and providing a rejoinder to any Western criticism of China. Almost 180 years after that clash between the Chinese and British empires, the Opium War retains an emotional resonance for many Chinese and offers a politically useful tool for the country's government. So, as you can see, this introduction lets us know that we're going to be talking about China and Europe's influence at this time on China. China is not an official colony, but this is a time in which many Western powers were looking to have what they call spheres of influence in China. So not an outright colony, but still able to control certain parts of. And the Opium War, which lasted from 1839 to 1842, continues to resonate emotionally with many Chinese. And as we'll see, in a nutshell, Britain's violent intrusion started the sale of very addictive opium to China's people, and that began what the Chinese still describe as a century of humiliation. Again, the introduction of this very addictive drugs and its negative side effects is going to be very humiliating to the Chinese as something that they see Westerners having come in and imposed on society. And most peoples of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America had to deal in some way with European imperialism. So we already talked about outright imperialism in our last chapter. Now we're talking about regions that aren't necessarily colonized, but again, they are controlled or heavily influenced in some way by the Western industrial countries. And so what did that look like for these nations? So this chapter focuses on societies that faced internal crises while maintaining formal independence. Again, they're not outright colonies. So there were 4 main dimensions of European imperialism that confronted these societies. Number 1, the military might and the political ambitions of rival European states. 2, the involvement in a new world economy that radiated from Europe because of the Industrial Revolution. So again, we're not talking about any kind of a Eurocentric worldview, but by default, this started with Europe because that's where the Industrial Revolution started. 3, the influence of aspects of traditional European culture, such as language, religion, and literature. And 4, engagement with the culture of modernity. Again, modernity coming about as a result of industrialization. So as they're dealing with these aspects of European imperialism, at the same time, these nations are going to have to deal with various internal pressures as well, which we will talk about. So we are going to be starting with China. So Reversals of Fortune is the title of this particular section. And remember, Reversal of Fortune, because remember how strong China was in the world back at the beginning of this class. And we talked about how China was really the strongest country politically and economically at the turn of what we would call the modern world, so about 1500. And now we're going to see China at a low ebb for the nation. So in 1793, the Chinese Emperor Qianlong rebuffed Britain's request that China rescind or loosen restrictions on trade. And this is going to be a big one. These various European countries and also the United States, so really I should say the Western world, because that includes Europe and the United States, they really are looking to access Chinese markets. And this is especially going to be the case as a result of industrialization. And remember, we talked about this as being a reason for these nations seeking colonies is A, raw materials, but B, they also want a market for their goods. They're producing goods, they want to sell them, and China's a large market, and they want to sell to China. And China had been very isolationist, and so various nations are going to be trying to chip away at that isolationism. So Chinese authorities had controlled and limited European activities for centuries. But by 1912, the Chinese Empire had completely collapsed and become a weak junior member in the European-dominated world, which, remember, that's a complete reversal of where China had been in 1500. This is a picture from the Taiping Uprising, one of the internal issues we're talking about. All right, so what happened? Again, I know I say it over and over again, but it's a wide lens, so we're talking in broad generalities here. But China was to a large degree a victim of its own success. Its population had grown exponentially from about 100 million in 1685 to some 430 million in 1853. So huge population growth. However, on the flip side, China didn't have an accompanying industrial revolution such as Great Britain and the rest of Europe, and then eventually the United States. If you want to get into the reasons why, more specifics about why it happened where it happened, again, I recommend the book, The Great Divergence, which really gets into the very nitty-gritty of how this happened, why it was Europe and not China that industrialized and that explored the world, etc. Very, very detailed. Want to read it on your own, you are welcome to it. It'll give you more in-depth information on that. So because they don't have an industrial revolution, there's going to be growing pressure on the land, impoverishment, unemployment, and starvation. Because again, huge increase in population, but no accompanying industrialization to help modernize farming techniques, and that's going to result in too little food for too many people. Additionally, the Chinese bureaucracy did not keep pace with growing population. The central state gradually lost control of provincial officials and gentry. So it's basically akin to saying if our federal government became weaker and weaker and weaker, and state governments became more strong, state governments became stronger, I should say, to the point where state governments each individual state was actually pretty much on its own. And the central government, the federal government, had very little say. So that's pretty much what's going on here. Also, as a result, there was a corruption and harsh treatment of peasants amongst officials. And because of this harsh treatment of peasants, bandit gangs and peasant rebellions became common because people typically don't take too kindly to being mistreated. And so rebellions became the norm. The culmination of China's internal crisis is the Taiping Uprising, which affected much of China from about 1850 to 1864, so quite a bit of time. Again, you can see that as we talk about China in this part, it's going to be a lot of uprisings, rebellions, unwanted incursions from foreign powers. It's just a lot of chaos. So the leader of this uprising, Hong Shoucheng, who lived from 1814 to 1864, proclaimed himself the younger brother of Jesus and believed that he was sent to establish, as a quote, a heavenly kingdom of great peace. And this called for radical equality in China, which was very rigidly structured at this time, and even called for a plan to industrialize China in the West. So you can see where the uprising occurred is in that I guess it's like a pinkish color. And then other uprisings that we're going to be talking about are in the purple color. So a lot that's going on. And also interesting to look at this map. You can see the formal European colonies surrounding China are going to be in like that greenish color. Formal Japanese, which we're going to talk about Japan as a special case here in a couple slides, is going to be in a purple color. And then look at the spheres of influence. So again, spheres of influence mean it's not an outright colony, but essentially these nations are controlling different aspects of another country. And you can see the British have some significant control and a foothold here in China. They're in this like dark orange color. Their posture towards women was also revolutionary. Women fought in their own regiments at this time. And the officials ordered the feet of women to be unbound. So pretty famous. You've probably heard about the practice of foot binding in China. But this is the practice of, if you've never heard of it before, you can look at some videos on YouTube. Essentially, it's where they would bind women's feet to make them as small as possible, such that you're bending the top, like the top part of your foot underneath the bottom part of your foot, like at the toe. So your big toe is being bent underneath. So you're essentially, I suppose the best way to describe it is like walking on your toes, because your toes would be put under. And they would do this by binding with cloth the feet of young girls before they hit puberty, and often using rocks to continually break the bones so that they could be molded, so that again, think about the top half of your foot going underneath, to make your feet very small. This was considered to be very attractive in China at the time. Not only the smallness of the feet, but the way women looked when they walked. Obviously, they wouldn't have a typical gait. They would have like kind of a swaying gait. And they actually have some video of like the last surviving women who had these bound feet. And also it's a way to keep women in a subservient role, because how much can you do? How much independence can you have with feet like this? And again, I don't know if I'm doing an adequate job. I should have put a link to a video in here, but again, you can just YouTube Chinese bound feet and you can see them. If you're squeamish, it might be a little hard to look at, but again, it's a way of keeping women in a subservient role. So here they're ordering women to not bind their feet. And this was so embedded in Chinese society that if you did not have bound feet, you couldn't make a good marriage. And so this is, again, very, very revolutionary. Anyway, the land program also promised men and women equal shares of land. That's pretty revolutionary throughout the world at this time. Women could also sit for the civil service exams. They could take up positions, usually overseeing other women, but still take up positions within the government. Marriage by mutual attraction was promoted, and not for political or economic gain, as was the way things were done prior to this. Their leader was more conservative in his views than the revolution as a whole would have demonstrated. But again, these are some pretty, not just revolutionary for China, but revolutionary for the time views on. But they don't last, because the rebellion doesn't last. They did have some initial successes, and that led to the establishment of a new capital in Nanjing in 1853. But ultimately, the rebellion was crushed in 1864. So you can say goodbye to all those hoped-for gains for women. The resolution of the Taiping Rebellion consolidated the power of the provincial gentry even more. Remember, this is where the main power is now in China. The central government has become weak. Provincial governments are much more strong. And the gentry, which is essentially pretty much the same as like an upper middle class, they're the ones who are in control in these regions. This is going to result in some intense conservatism. So it's like the revolutionaries were pushed too far to, we would call it in the Western world, to the left, pushed too far towards progressive views. And so the result when traditional authority was restored is a push way far to the right. So there's going to be some intense conservatism, and as a result, China's problems are not resolved. And the massive civil war had seriously weakened the Chinese economy. Wars are very expensive. Civil wars are intensely damaging. And about 20 to 30 million people died as a result of the rebellion. Okay, so now the Western powers are going to come on the scene. Again, they've been there. They're constantly trying to have more access to trade with China than they're being allowed. The Chinese government is trying to restrict their access and thus restrict their influence. And so here we have in come the Opium Wars onto the scene. The Opium Wars show the transformation of China's relationship with Europe. So opium had been used on a small scale in China for centuries. It wasn't an unheard of drug. However, the British started to sell large quantities of Indian opium in China. How did they do this? Well, remember, they had some pretty big spheres of influence in China that enabled them to do that. Why would they want to do this? Well, because selling something that is highly addictive is highly profitable also, if you're not someone who really cares about the morality of it. The Chinese authorities also recognized the dangers of opium addiction and tried to stop the trade. And I think the dangers to any kind of addiction are pretty obvious to us in the world, something that they did not want. And you can see men here participating in an opium den, smoking opium, again, very highly addictive and debilitating drug. However, European merchants simply bribed officials to smuggle opium in. Hey, if there's money to be made, there's plenty of people who are willing to look the other way for a price. As a result, China suffered a specie drain in large quantities because silver was spent in large portion on opium. And who does that benefit? The British and other European merchants who are smuggling this addictive opium in. In 1836, the emperor decided to suppress trade. And the British responded with the First Opium War, which lasted from 1839 to 1842. In the result of this war, they forced the Chinese to accept free trade and quote-unquote proper relations among countries. Again, that is the goal, to open up China to more trade for European goods. And the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 restricted Chinese sovereignty within their borders and opened up 5 Chinese ports to European traders. In the Second Opium War, from 1856 to 1858, Europeans had vandalized the Imperial Summer Palace, and that resulted in another outbreak of violence. And so, as a result, more treaty ports were opened up to foreigners. Foreigners could also travel freely and buy Chinese land. China was also open to foreign missionaries. So you see the spread of the influence of Christianity. And Western powers were given the right to patrol some of China's interior waterways. And so this is exactly the opposite of all the things that the Chinese wanted. Remember, they were very isolationist up until this point, hoping to keep out the influence of Western. China was also defeated by the French in 1885 and the Japanese in 1895. As a result, they lost control of some of their own areas of influence, including Vietnam, Korea, and Taiwan. And the Qing dynasty was so deeply weakened at this time. And this is a problem because this is a time in which China needed a strong government to deal with the incursion of modernization, to deal with the incursion of new ideas, and they just don't have it. And so these unequal treaties, which clearly benefited European and Japanese powers, and not the Chinese, really inhibited China's industrialization and put them behind the rest of the world. So in this picture, we see this is an official ordering the destruction of opium and an attempt to get rid of this influence, this negative influence. You can kind of think of it as China's attempt for the war on drugs to try to get rid of these harmful substances. So conservative leaders feared that this development would harm the landlord class. New industries were largely thus dependent on foreigners, and they strengthened local authorities rather than the central state. Another uprising is going to occur in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Boxer Uprising. In this uprising, the militia organizations killed many Europeans and Chinese Christians, and also besieged foreign embassies in Beijing. So this is in response to the incursion of Western influence in China. Western powers and Japan occupied Beijing to crush the revolt. Again, they don't want to lose their influence in the region. And they imposed a massive reparation payments on China for damages in this uprising. So, the failure of the conservative modernization. The Chinese government tried to act against their problems. They had a policy of self-strengthening in the 1860s and the 1870s with the application of traditional principles along with very limited borrowing from the West. They tried to improve the examination system. So remember, that's the civil service exam is the exam you would take in order to become a bureaucrat in the Chinese government. Also, restoration of rural social and economic order through the support of landlords, the repair of irrigation systems, foundation of a few new industrial factories, and the establishment of some modern arsenals and shipyards, and also some study of other languages and science. However, a growing number of educated Chinese became disillusioned with the Qing dynasty. Organizations to examine the situation and propose reforms took place. There was a growing drive for a truly unified nation in which more people took part in public life, more access for people to get involved in the civil service and the bureaucracy. Chinese nationalism, however, was against both foreign imperialist and the foreign Qing dynasty, and the government agreed to some reforms in the early 20th century, but not enough, resulting in the imperial order collapsing in 19. So, to compare that to another empire that is in trouble at this time, the Ottoman Empire. Both China and the Ottoman Empire felt that they did not need to learn from the West. You're going to see a belief, a pushing away of Western influences. They were both able to avoid direct colonial rule, but were still diminished on the world stage. They both attempted a defensive modernization. So think about some reforms that China took on as a way to try to stem the attractiveness of foreign influences. And both suffered a split in society between modernists and those holding traditional values. All right. So this is the Ottoman Empire, as we're going to see in a minute, often referred to at this time as the sick old man of Europe. It is in decline pretty substantially at this time. So you can see in purple is the territory they lost from 1800 to 1877. The tannish color is territory lost 1878 to 1913. And the green is the territory that's left in 1914. And we'll see the end of World War I is the end of the Ottoman Empire. So World War I breaks out in 1914. That gives you an idea of how much territory was left by the time World War I broke out. And that gives you an idea of the trouble that the Ottoman Empire was in. So again, it was referred to as the sick old man of Europe, even though, Ottoman Empire's got 1 foot in and 1 foot out of Europe, so it's a little bit of both. In 1750, the Ottoman Empire was still strong. It was pretty much the center of the Islamic world, but by 1900, it was known as the sick old man of Europe. So big reversal in fortunes, similar to China at the time. Region by region, the Islamic world fell under Christian rule, and the Ottomans couldn't prevent that from happening. So again, refer back to the map that we just looked at a second ago. They lost territory to Russia, Britain, Austria, and France. Napoleon, his 1798 invasion of Egypt was especially devastating. So don't know, Napoleon is from France. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania also attained independence in the southeastern part of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkans. A lot of territories lost. Not surprisingly, the Central Ottoman state had weakened. And again, similar to China, you see as the central authority weakens, provincial authority becomes powerful. So provincial authorities and local warlords were able to gain more power, and this limited the government's ability to raise money because they have to go through them, and that's a tricky process. Also, the Janissaries had become militarily ineffective. Their economy was hard hit by Western developments. Again, Europe industrializes first, and so that's by default going to give them an advantage. However limited it might have been, because again, who got there first doesn't necessarily matter, but if you're not going to industrialize as well, that's going to be a problem. As a result, Europeans had also achieved direct access to Asia. They don't need the middlemen of the Ottoman Empire anymore. Cheap European manufactured goods harmed Ottoman artisans. If you are someone producing something on a small scale, handmade items, and you have something that can be manufactured in a factory, the factory goods are obviously cheaper because you can make more of them faster. And so people like to buy things that are, typically they like things that are cheaper. Foreign merchants also won immunity from Ottoman laws and taxes, and the government came to rely on foreign loans to finance any kind of economic developmental efforts. So as a result, that last point, they had really reached a state of dependency on Europe. Here we see a picture of Ottoman modernization. They're obviously by a train, and so the establishment of a railway would be a sign of modernization. So the Ottomans attempted an ambitious reforms, going a lot further than the Chinese. Again, the Chinese reforms are pretty limited, but of course there's going to be any kind of time you have any kind of change, there's going to be people who are opposed to that change, whether or not the change is good or bad. They didn't have an internal crisis on the scale of China. Think about all the different rebellions we talked about. They don't have any kind of internal upheaval, but they didn't have to deal with explosive population growth in the way that China did. And their rulers were Turkic and Muslim, like the majority of the people in the Ottoman Empire, not foreign like the Qing. So, in the late 18th century, Salim III tried to establish a new military and administrative structures. These were based on European advisors and techniques. However, these reforms were seen to be in conflict with Islam and with institutional interests, and so he was overthrown and murdered in 1807. So those were not so great. Supporters of reform saw the Ottoman Empire as more of a secular state. So the Ottoman Empire is not it's not one of those nations in which church and state are separate. They are very much combined into one. And this reform created a new class of writers, thinkers, scholars, etc., called the Young Ottomans. They urged the creation of a constitutional regime, something more akin to the constitutional monarchy such as they have in Great Britain. And they wanted what they called Islamic modernism. They accepted Western technology and science, but not its materialism. So, another attempt at reform. Sultan Abd al-Hamid II accepted the new constitution and an elected parliament in 1876 that limited the Sultan's authority. Again, I guess kind of similar to a constitutional monarchy such as you see in Britain. But he almost immediately suspended it, so that's not greatly helpful, and turned to an older style of despotism in the face of a Russian invasion, taking power back to the center. So, first Ottoman constitution. Opposition coalesced around another group called the Young Turks, which were made up of military and civilian elites. They advocated a militantly secular public life and wanted to shift to thinking in terms of a Turkish national state rather than the Ottoman Empire. A military coup in 1908 gave the Young Turks some real power. They pushed for a radical secularization of schools, courts, and law codes. So again, separation of church and state here. They permitted, church and state is how we would obviously say it in the West or in the United States. It's not a Christian nation. This is a Muslim nation. They permitted elections and competing parties, the law of family rights for all, and encouraged Turkish as the official language. Again, the Ottoman Empire was a very big empire. It included places that were not heavily Muslim and not Turkish in ethnicity, and so there's a push to encourage Turkish as the official language for more national unity. Also opening modern schools for women, allowing them to wear Western dress, restriction of polygamy, having multiple wives, and permitting some divorce. Also, they antagonized non-Turkic people in the Ottoman Empire, specifically Armenians. Talk more about that. And they stimulated Arab and other nationalisms in response. And the Ottoman Empire is going to be completely disintegrated after World War I. So, conclusion of World War I, Treaty of Versailles, there's not going to be an Ottoman Empire anymore. So, to compare again, by 1900, both China and the Ottoman Empire were semi-colonies. Again, they're not outright colonies, but heavily dependent and influenced by the West. Both gave rise to a new nationalist conception of society. For China, the imperial system collapsed completely in 1912, followed by a vast revolution and the creation of a communist regime in 1949 within the same territory, which is getting ahead of what we're talking about here, but that's going to be the outcome. For the Ottoman Empire, it collapses again following World War I, and it is no more. And Chinese revolutionaries rejected Confucian culture much more than Turkish leaders rejected Islam. Okay, so the Japanese difference, the rise of a new East Asian power. So remember when we talked about foreign influence on China, we didn't just mention European countries, we also mentioned Japan. So what's going on in Japan? Well, Japan was forced to open up to more quote-unquote normal relations with the world by U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. So from 1853, when this happens, to 1900, there is a radical transformation of Japanese society. It became powerful, modern, united, industrialized, and it created its own East Asian empire. It's a new power on the scene, the culmination of which we'll see in World War II, which some people believe that World War II in Asia should almost be viewed as like a separate war, but that's kind of getting beyond the scope of this. All right, so the Tokugawa background. The Tokugawa shoguns had ruled since 1600. And their main task was preventing civil war among rival feudal lords called the daimyo. Feudal lords kind of similar to what we're talking about if you think about like feudal Europe, where you have a local landowner having a lot of power, and that can become a dangerous situation because they may go to war with each other, and you don't want a civil war. However, Japanese enjoyed internal peace from 1600 to 1850. The daimyo were strictly regulated but retained considerable autonomy. Japan wasn't unified by a single law, currency, or central authority that reached down to the local level. Again, think of more of like a feudal England at the time, where you have a very decentralized power base. You have very powerful local landlords. And it's a very hierarchical society. So you have samurais at the top, then peasants, artisans, and then merchants at the bottom. However, there's going to be some considerable change in Japan underway. Eventually, the samurai evolved into more of a bureaucratic administrative class as opposed to a military class. There was great economic growth, commercialization, and urban development. And by 1750, Japan was perhaps the most urbanized country. They had very high literacy rates, 40% among males and 15% among females, which doesn't seem like a lot, but in 1750, that was a high literacy rate. And change made it impossible for the shogunate to freeze society, and so corruption was also widespread. Okay, then there's going to be the American intrusion into Japan. The United States sent Commodore Perry in 1853 to demand better treatment for castaways, the right for American ships to refuel and buy provisions, and the opening of trade ports. Kind of similar to what we saw in China, where they want access to Japan as a source for trade. Not on the scale that they wanted access to China, because it obviously doesn't have the population that China had. But again, the right to refuel, to buy provisions, things like that. That's what they're really looking for. And so by agreeing to the demands of the quote-unquote foreign devils, this triggers a civil war within Japan. You see a depiction of a United States ship as being a harbinger of In 1868, a group of young samurai from the south took over. They claimed to be restoring the emperor to power, and they aimed to save Japan from foreigners by the transformation of Japanese society rather than by resistance. So again, a different approach, hence the title of this section, The Japanese Difference. However, the West wasn't as interested in Japan as it was in China. Again, less population, less market for goods, and so it reduced the pressure as a result. So, how did the Japanese modernize, and how was it different? Well, their first task was creating national unity, attacking the power and the privileges of the upper class, dismantling the Confucian-based social order, and allowing almost all Japanese to become legally equal, at least in the eyes of the law. There was also widespread interest in many aspects of the West, from science to something like as simple as hairstyles. Official missions were sent to the West. Hundreds of students went to study abroad in Western nations, and there was the translation of Western books into Japanese. Eventually, this interest in the West settled down to a more selective borrowing of the West. Christianity in general made little progress. In China, the Shinto was raised to a level of a state cult. They recognized that oppression of women impeded modernization. There was universal education, segregated by sex, but still education for women. But however, women were prohibited from public life. Here we see an image of Japanese women workers. So this is a state-guided industrial program. They established model factories, opened mines, built railroads, created postal currency and banking systems. There were many state enterprises that were then sold to private investors. And this accomplished modernization without acquiring foreign debt. So again, it's a selective borrowing of, they're not opposed to necessarily Western incursion. They want to modernize, they want to industrialize, but doing it in their own way, on their own terms. However, society paid a heavy price. Many peasant families were impoverished, as is the case we talked about with industrialization in the West. When that first occurred, we talked about which was the class that suffered the most: the working class, the laboring classes. In the countryside, there was, unfortunately, infanticide, the sale of daughters, starvation. A lot of early urban workers, especially women, received very harsh treatment, and any efforts to organize unions were repressed. However, by the early 20th century, Western powers readjusted treaties in Japan's favor, and this resulted in Japanese empire building. They went to war against China, 1894 to 1895, a very successful war against Russia from 1904 to 1905 that severely weakened the Tsarist regime in Russia to the point that they don't last much longer afterwards. And they gained colonial control of Taiwan and Korea, as well as winning a foothold in Manchuria. So it's going to be something that's going to be picked back up in the 1930s. Japan was widely admired as a model for development or a potential ally against imperialism, and Japan's colonial policies were at least as brutal as the European ones, and specifically, probably more famous than these colonial policies would be their empire building at the start of World War II. All right, so to reflect, successes and failure in history. We have to be very careful in applying ideas of success and failure to historical complexities. It really depends on the criteria we apply. So we have to consider the issue of success for whom. So can we say Japan successfully industrialized? Well, again, success for who? Certainly not success for the rural families who had to resort to selling off daughters and infanticide and who were starving. That's not successful for them, but it was certainly successful for others. So in general, I would say you have to be very careful about using these kinds of like broad terms, Same as using like good or bad to describe people in the past. It's very problematic. Historical actors, as it says in the last point here, are never completely free in making decisions, and they lack the benefit of hindsight, which we of course have. That's not necessarily a bad thing that we look back and we are critical, because it's how we learn, right? How can we learn from the past if we don't say, okay, well, what went wrong here? That's not the problem. The problem is, like, again, labeling things: success, failure, good, bad. Some people in the past, a caveat, some people in the past were obviously very clearly bad, your Hitlers of the world. But again, for a lot of history, you have to be very, very careful making those broad generalizations. So I remember that, just as a side note and as an example, when I was writing my master's thesis on the orphan trains, a lot of people were like, well, why don't you write your paper on whether or not it made made the kids' lives better or not? And it's like, well, better is too broad of a term. Like, if I'd have to come up with parameters. What does a better life mean? And in any case, I'm imposing my interpretation of what a better life is on someone else. And that might have not have been what they considered a better life. So you just have to be very, very careful. Again, I say it all the time, the past is like a foreign country. You have to be very careful when you use these labels in history. You have to be more nuanced than that. Is something like the modernization of Japan successful? In some ways. Did it fail in others? Yes, it did. So again, you have to be a more nuanced as opposed to looking at things in terms of black and white. All right. So our chapter question this time around concerns China. Read the following sources: 19.1, point 2, point 3, and point 5. And answer the following question. China as a culture and a political system must be destroyed in order to preserve China as a nation. To what extent would the creators of these sources have agreed or disagreed with this statement?